Okay, so we get off my soapbox and get on my other soapbox. Who am I? PhD 2016, largely in biosignal analysis and physiology. I did a lot of work in meta science in the last 7 or 8 years as well. That, as Jürgen says, is on error detection. But this is what I do all day now on the right-hand side. Software, you can see an avatar on a screen where a little fella's moving up and down. That's not actually a patient. That's one of our engineers that we persecuted to make the promo video. And the thing that you can just see on his knee is a compression garment. The compression garment is tracking range of motion, biometric signals, etc. So I'm the chief scientific officer of this company called Cyphoskin. And we build that, and physical therapists and orthopedic surgeons buy it. And I do research with it. I facilitate other people doing research with it. And I do a lot of company strategy stuff, as might be expected. Help run the company, more or less. We're not going to talk about any of that. The important part there is simply the bolded meta science. We're also not going to talk about all the other stuff Jürgen mentioned. Error detection, not really. Podcast, not really. Mice 450 movement, any other reasons that you might have heard of me and whatever Z-grade notoriety that happens. None of it's particularly relevant here. We're going really deep into some of the mechanics of peer review and what I suppose is my response to them that is largely COVID mediated. But we'll get to that. Basically, any other reason you might have heard of me is going to be moderately irrelevant at this point, which is okay. So I always do a concept slide because I have a tendency to put concepts into talks that I give and then assume that people can read my mind. So I started doing this as opposed to requesting anyone has Daryl Bem-like psychic powers. So all of these should be reasonably self-evident. A faith game is basically an exercise of mutual trust. I don't mean this in the game theoretic sense. I mean it in the assumption of the accuracy of scientific information. Less important here than the next two. The second one is a retreat to formalism. Now, this is a somewhat recognized logical fallacy in the sort of linguistic casual sense rather than the formal sense. A retreat to formalism is basically saying if a process exists, then if something is correct, it's correct according to the process, not correct according to anything else. We're going to see a little bit of that pop up later on. A process exists, thus anything outside it is unnecessary or incorrect. And an irrevocable qualification is basically what peer review does in the sense that I don't like. It means that at some point in time, peer review occurs. Anything after this means something is peer reviewed in perpetuity, and therefore it is right and scientifically appropriate. Before that, it isn't. So it's a categorical designation. Peer review in many respects is a lot like getting a PhD. It's really hard to unget a PhD. You have to do some pretty heavy duty malfeasance, break a lot of rules to be able to have a PhD removed or changed. So it's an irrevocable status, right? Okay, concepts. So my historical position has not been particularly antithetical to peer review. I don't dislike it. I don't think it's a bad idea. I've done a lot of it. You're welcome to look up my profile on Publons, which I've maintained for a couple of years. I think I have maybe 50 peer reviews that I bothered to include in that. So I've done plenty, I suppose. It was easy during I had a very focused PhD, so it was very easy during my PhD. I got sent a lot from a lot of different journals. On biosignal analysis, physiology, signal processing, various bits and pieces of social science methodology, and some meta science papers as well, although there really aren't that many of them sufficient that I get a lot to peer review. So I'm not badly disposed towards it as an institution, not really. I love preprints. Mainly because I have the patience of a 5-year-old who has discovered a stash of caffeine tablets in a kitchen cupboard. And the ability to be able to put something in the public domain and then immediately talk about it is really appealing to me. But that's not a scientific designation. That's just me. So I love that. I love the ability to access an immediate conversation about something I've been working on. A lot of people really don't, and that is perfectly fine. I also don't like not getting paid for for work that I do, which is where the 450 movement came from, which is somewhat inflammatory. If you haven't heard, I made a big fuss a couple of years ago about wanting to get paid to do peer review, but that was a detail that people miss about that, is that's largely tied to the fact that I am not paid by the government or the government in a step-through process to be an academic anymore. I have a regular job. I'm a regular person who works for a regular company. And if you want 5 hours of my time, traditionally people pay you. That's generally how commercial relationships work. That's how I establish commercial relationships with other people. But throughout that entire time, I have still been peer reviewing things for friends of mine, and for people who turn up through my network, and for community journals. I got lit up late last week because I'm late on one right now. I just straight up forgot that I had to do it, and I got a good talking to from the editor. I'm still out there doing it. What has really bothered me is what has happened to the various adventures in meta science I have had during COVID. And it has been a very bad experience with the mechanics of just exactly how we do formal scientific assessment. It was bad when Jürgen asked me to give the talk, and it would have been really annoying if it had gotten better in the intervening 8 months, but it hasn't. So happily, we still have that topic, right? So this is my reevaluation. This is my should before the ability to execute and do anything about it. So what is it and what do we hope it does? We have a paper, regardless of whether or not it's a preprint or an actual published article. The paper has long-run consequences of whether or not it's correct, whether or not people pay attention to it, whether or not it is something that is generative, or whether or not it's something that has drawbacks, I suppose, whether it's full of blind alleys or whether it's horribly misinformed. And that, in many respects, is somewhat divorced of the consequences of what happens to it during review. There are tremendously inconsequential peer-reviewed papers, which is a lot of them, and there are tremendously consequential preprints where no one even really thinks about whether or not it was eventually published. The introduction of the information or the ideas that are in the document itself is the important part and remains the important part in perpetuity. So what would we hope if we have this process that is supposed to contribute to that? Although it's not really in the continuum of one to the other, it is separate. So it's separate. What does it do? Well, we would hope that it looks at the data and the data as it pertains to the analysis that's presented. We'd hope it would look for things like plagiarism, that it would assess the methods. Usually, this is a big one. Maybe I should have put that in a bigger font. Whether or not everything is methodologically appropriate. The scope and the plausibility of the conclusions. You can have something that has sensible data, sensible analysis, is all original work, is methodologically appropriate, and then has a conclusion that's wildly out of scope, really overclaims. So I suppose the interpretation of that information that's there. It may have some very, very wishy-washy idea of novelty or local interest, which is a combination of has this ever been seen or done before, with how much should anybody care in the estimation of a very small group of editors at a journal. And then, of course, there's other accuracy or citation errors, the housekeeping, essentially, of the journal, which is not to undersell housekeeping. It's phenomenally important when it comes to establishing baseline accuracy. I'm a big fan of housekeeping. I've made something of a career out of what might essentially amount to that. So the conception for a very long time really has been that peer review isn't very good. There's a million quotes from Richard Smith, which you see here. This is one from 2009. I like this paragraph more than the others, some of which are more caustic than this. He was the editor of the British Medical Journal for about 15 years, a very famous editor. He still writes on this topic. There are similar quotes to this from Richard Horton, who was editor of The Lancet, and from Robbie Fox, who was the previous editor of The Lancet. So yes, all medical journals, yes, all English, but also the same attitude. And people read quotes like this. Evidence of the upside of peer review is sparse, while evidence on the downside is abundant. And I think they have the impression that these guys are trying to be edgy. You know, they're trying to say something that's kind of cutting, a little bit counterintuitive. Maybe it's some kind of cry for attention or continued relevance because they are not young men anymore. No, they're dead serious. And the reason that they're dead serious is not because they've lost faith entirely in the process. It's because it's actually really easy to test whether or not peer review has any empirical basis. And that's this part here. And he says, now large body of evidence. That's not referring to their impressions stochastically formed over years. That's referring to the scientometric and other associated research literature on the accuracy of the process. So let's actually split some of the pieces of that out. And we go back to my previous flowchart, and we'll just take the methodology version. This is, every time there's a slide like this, I promise you there's 6, 10 other papers that are here. I have a limited amount of time, but the reason that it's easy to know that there are problems with this as a process is because it's very, very easy to construct papers that are like this. Basically, you take a manuscript as a template and you introduce a series of really common errors. That's it. We all understand how to solicit peer review, except this time it's solicited in an experimental context rather than for the real thing. But for all intents and purposes, it's exactly the same as it was previously. So basically, you cook a paper up so it has a variety of problems, and then you give it to real peer reviewers. And that makes a really, really good analog of the task itself. It's not like saying, I know something about the neuroticism of all humanity because I tested it on 80 white undergraduates from Minnesota. That is a very culturally situated question. These are not. These are good empirical tests, and a lot of them have hundreds of individual data points on whether or not problems can be detected. So I don't really need to blow any of these up. In general, you get somewhere from 1/4 to 3/4 of all the major problems introduced into a manuscript that are just left by the wayside, even when people know that they're in a process that is experimenting on them to see if they can do peer review properly. They miss major conclusions, they overlook major weaknesses, they fail to identify major errors. That Schroeder paper, if you go, obviously you can have the slides from this one. I put the links into the DOI, so you should be able to find them really easily. Yeah, on average, less than 3 out of 9 major errors identified, and they are major errors. They're things like I have no description of my randomization process because ostensibly I didn't do it. That's an error. I mean, that is something that should definitely be pointed out. So that's actually the good bit. So at least these things are being found on aggregate, and we can imagine a world where if we had 2 or maybe 3 reviewers and we were trying to make the right binary decision about, do we continue to work with this paper and do some form of revision or accept it? Or do we say this paper will never have inherent accuracy or interest to our journal and then reject it? Maybe with enough people over enough time, we can find the right answer, if there is such a thing. Maybe. but we'll get to that. We have to do something worse. So Cole et al. 2015 is one of my favorite papers because rather than making methodological errors, they put in numerical errors. And there's also this separate body of literature on this. So in research like this, these people were doing what we do in error detection, like my collaborators and me still participating to a minor degree. They were doing this well before it was cool. You take a template manuscript and you introduce a discontinuity between a table and a footnote, or between a table and a text. You make statistical outputs that can't exist, p-values that don't match t-values, impossible beta values, numbers that can't possibly be the case. We actually found that the test that I was working on with Nick Brown, that's called GRIM, that some people might be familiar with. We found a paper that presupposed that without ever giving it a name or talking about it, which is about the accuracy of data that is essentially made out of fractions. We found that they'd put an incorrect result in a paper to test accuracy during peer review that presupposed the existence of us ever giving it a name or being interested in the topic in the first place. And less than half of editors check for plagiarism, and that's the good editors who will answer a survey. That's another good paper from the group at the University of Melbourne, I believe, that Hamilton paper. 95% of discrepancies go unnoticed, and I highlight this part because it's really interesting, even by readers specifically asked to look for them and directed to the figures and tables. So in an experiment where you say this experiment is on numbers that are wrong, and you direct people to go looking for them, and you tell them where to look, they still don't find them. It is hard. People immediately say, oh, that seems dire. Why? Why is it so dire? And the best answer that I've got, I like this answer, but I have no immediate ability to demonstrate it. The best answer that I've got is the mindset that you have when you're reviewing or reading a paper has to be, just by virtue of the fact that you're trying to get information from it, you have to be trying to retain information. And it is exhausting to change your perspective for reading science to, I'm making the assumption that everything's wrong and it needs to be checked. It's the difference between like an investor mindset, if you're reading a financial series of financial figures, or an auditor's mindset, where you distrust everything and you try and make sure that it's full of internal consistency. So this is when Richard Smith says the large body of evidence, he is talking about a lot of individual papers that are in this area, papers that in general receive, I think, a dramatically reduced amount of attention compared to what I would ideally give them. This is well investigated. This is not me being an angry young man, although I'm not angry or young anymore. I promise you, this isn't hyperbole. All of these processes are well investigated. So with that in mind, I feel like I have the ability to make this. Data and analysis, not particularly well assessed by the process. Methodology, plagiarism, accuracy, that's what the evidence says. And what are we left with? We're left with basically what everyone has accused journals of doing this entire time, which is evaluating something on the basis of its kind of overall plausibility according to the vibe, and how well and how sufficient is the information here that it fits my fancy journal to a given degree of fanciness. So basically heuristics, not how accurate will it be, how will it be seen in 5 years. It's heuristics, because all of these other pieces that we sincerely hope are being evaluated for are not well evaluated. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that the easiest way to become good at publishing stuff is basically through the sort of the appropriate boosting and faux sophistication of the language involved, because this is basically a giant vibe check. Is this sufficient? Does this vibe with my area of publication? Now, vibe check ain't never been science, but that is essentially what this amounts to. And this is why these people who've been the editors of journals that are some of the most prestigious on the planet have such a negative opinion of the process that they oversaw, is because presumably they read all this evidence, they participated in some of it, and ended up in a situation where they realized that what they're doing is not a empirical process at all. So I have highlighted also here the long-run consequences of this paper, our hypothetical peer-reviewed paper here, because that is, again, that's separate. And we're going to get back to that long-run consequences when we talk about preprints. But what happens to the short-run consequences? Well, if we're going to vibe check everything, what we end up basically with is an environment where we end up doing some journal shopping. Now, journal shopping is pretty straightforward. You send a manuscript to a journal, they say, we don't like it, or they say, here's a series of things we would have you change, and you realize that would take a very long time. And often there's reasons you can't change them, like the person who did all the work doesn't work there anymore, which is really common with short-term contracts of PhD students and postdocs, etc. People move on, people change institutions. So go back and do more work. A lot of the time it's not even an option. It's not just because people are lazy, it's because they're literally not available. But regardless of the circumstances, a paper that goes to journal A and then is rejected summarily is usually sent to journal B. And if the same thing happens, likewise C, likewise D. I know I've heard this story so many times from like an expert in an area. I reviewed a paper for a journal. I said it wasn't very good for a variety of reasons. The paper was withdrawn or it was rejected. And then I got sent a review for the same manuscript from a different journal where they hadn't changed anything that I'd pointed out before. And the inevitable question there is, can I just copy and paste my previous review and send that back because the paper hasn't changed, so presumably my opinion hasn't changed? Yeah. I don't think I've ever heard of anyone getting 3. Certainly 2, a lot. I don't think anyone's ever seen the same manuscript for a third time. But if we continually vibe check without a sort of an empirical basis for saying like this cannot be included, this must work, this mustn't work, then it makes an environment where you continually encourage this churn. The key principle to remember is everything eventually gets published somewhere. So multiply that by how many requests do you need to send to get 2 reviews? I got interested in this a while ago. There's an estimate from the Publon State of Peer Review Survey that was in 2018. And they said the average across all fields, I think, was 5. And that was 5 years ago. And also probably a more scientific version of my straw poll. And I asked everyone I knew who was an editor, there's a dozen people, maybe more. How many requests do you have to send right now to get 2 reviews back in the right scope, in the right time, etc.? And the minimum was 7, and the highest was 42. I sincerely hope that that's an outlier because that's an awful lot of requests. Also, as they're asynchronous, I mean, you spend an awful lot of time waiting to find out what happened. You can't, if you send them out sequentially one after the other, I mean, that could take a year waiting for everyone to say yes or no. Likewise, there's, I think, 2.5 million research objects a year, something like that. 1.5 million of those are in journals that need to be read, and we've just added the entirety of COVID on top of that, while everything else is, which obviously, as we're going to get to, is something that requires immediate attention. Okay, let's not get too bogged down. Quick trip through history, just for context here. Journals used to have associate editors to get papers, not to review them and send them back, but hopefully to actually fill the pages of the journals to begin with. That's why you had a single editor and a group of associate editors. They were literally writing letters to people saying, please do work on this and send it to us. There was literally more journal than there was articles to go into the journals. And that was actually the historical norm. It changed with the typewriter, and it changed again with fax. And then finally it changed with Xerox. And then of course, the gigantic step change was the digital change. But peer review hasn't really been the de facto standard until about 1975. It was reasonably messy before that, and a lot of it was simply the editor's discretion. So with that in mind, I thought, where's the first reference I can find to someone complaining about just how long this takes because of how much it's all put, the pressure that's put on the system. How often is it the information has to change hands? So this is a great quote, and I don't know if we have a chat here. If we do, I can't see it very well, and I think if I open it, it will kill my slideshow. So hold the guess of this very contemporary sounding paragraph in your head for when this was published. And you probably aren't early enough. Peer reviewing system gobbles time and huge unchewed mouthfuls. Author and reviewer are victims. Maybe publication requested a paper be evaluated within 2 weeks. That sounds contemporary. Some people manage, but is it 2 people? The demands on the time becomes intolerable, etc. 1974. Okay. Now, I've probably gone too far in establishing the sort of historical precedent here. So let's see if we can pick it up a little. I have not had a good plague with this. As I stepped away from actually doing the job of science for money, it became increasingly obvious that some of the work that I did was sort of really useful for the planet, because there was a lot of poor COVID research being published, and some of it was really dangerous. So this has meant more wrangling with and contact with the peer review system than I might have otherwise thought after having left science. And obviously this happened at a time where there was increased need for the information that scientists produce for how everyone lives their lives on a daily basis. And it hasn't gone amazingly well. We needed a lot of information very quickly, but there's also been some just astonishing mistakes over time. An enormous amount of retractions. I think this morning's total is 211 individual COVID retractions. And a laundry list of these examples where everything hasn't worked very well. I'm only going to do 2, but I promise you when it comes to these stories and the things that we're about to discuss, I'm presenting 2 examples. I promise you I have about 10 of these, but we don't have 2.5 hours to be able to cover all of them. So let's just get to the nice part before we start. I'm actually quite heartened by one aspect of this and how well a peer review has done during COVID. And it's the fact that it turns out we could change it the whole time. When it comes to innovating within scientific publishing, it's very, very hard because there's so many entrenched interests. It's simply been done this way forever. There's not a lot of commercial entry. None of us can go out and start an amazing journal that works on a completely different set of principles from scratch. It's really hard. Only a very small amount of people are allowed to do that. But it turns out collectively we could have changed peer review the entire time, because we've decided that more or less every journal that I've seen has got a very fast triage capacity for being able to review something really quickly if they think it's necessary, and the ability to split those into 2 separate streams, have really fast review. Preprints became extremely popular, and we decided, I think collectively, that if they were going to be really popular, everyone had to understand what they were. And that's actually been really useful in and of itself. Now there are preprints everywhere. Everyone here knows what a preprint is by now, but the collective understanding of them has shifted to, okay, we understand that this is not peer reviewed. We understand that there's a different capacity to this information. Everyone knows that now. I think that's kind of great, because trust me, like 2 years ago, exactly 2 years ago now, maybe a touch more, people really didn't. It's really been the this has really been the kind of the happy hunting ground of the preprint. It's changed a lot, and that's probably a good thing. But let's get on with the bad things. So here's a case study. This is working with Dave Grimes. He was sent, a BBC journalist sent him a paper that was on the 5G effects on miscarriage, and said there's a tremendous fear that this, because 5G, the frequency, has somehow managed to make the magical change to being ionizing radiation and is out there hurting everyone. People might not remember, but 18 months ago, this was very much the kind of conspiracy du jour, the fact that 5G was either causing COVID or exacerbating it or making it worse. And there were these papers that were doing the rounds within the community of people who believed that. And this journalist sent him a paper and said, well, here's one that purports to show the effects of 5G on miscarriage. And this is a strong sort of supporting plank of the 5G COVID people. We looked at this paper. It is not a good paper in a way that we do not have time to get into. You can read our paper on what we call promiscuous dichotomization, which is basically if you have a continuum and you get to choose exactly where you want to put a cut in that continuum to make high and low, what is the mathematics of being able to do that? And how many claims can you make if you get that as an analytical environment? The answer is you can claim almost anything you like. So methodologically, very, very weak paper, really problematic. So we saw that and thought, well, this paper is a few years old, but we should probably write to the journal anyway. We write to the journal. The editors looked into it. They asked for a formal paper. We wrote them a formal paper. The formal paper was reviewed by 3 separate people. That was sent to the original authors. The original authors wrote a response. The journal declined to publish the author's response, which probably means it wasn't very good. And eventually this manuscript as a matters arising paper was published 18 months after this process began. 18 months at the point in time where it really could have made a difference to the collective conversation in the misinformation around this disease. It took us 18 months to be able to boss this paper through. And I should add, this is with a committed journal group and a good editor who wrote back to emails and a fully functional review system with good review comments, and everything worked the way it was supposed to. And it took 18 months. When we see information go viral in hours or days or weeks, you realize that there used to be a dichotomy between quick things, quick social digital things, and slow things, slow academic process things. And it hasn't gotten better at the point in time where it's become really important to be able to broaden peer review to include what's going wrong at the time, what's going wrong right now. At the exact point in time where we need that, it's gotten worse. Next case study. So this is actually an interesting one because it involves an initial preprint. There is an initial preprint in November 2020. An article is pre-printed. The article is very, this is not mistakes. This article has text duplicated in sections. It has impossible numbers that can't exist. It has uploaded data where the data is literally duplicated between, let's say, rows 110 through 120 are the same as rows 140 through 150. It's just sort of copied and pasted. that's really the only viable explanation. There's no other way that those features can appear unless you duplicate sections of the data. This is very, very, very bad. Now, it is a preprint, so it does not go through peer review, but the preprint some months later immediately goes into a meta-analysis, and the meta-analysis says that this paper is of a low risk of bias. I'll just leave that. Obviously, it isn't. I am peripherally involved in this. Most of this work is done by Gideon Meyerowitz-Katz, Nick Brown, my old school collaborator, and Jack Lawrence, who was the guy who found the problem in the first place. They outlined some very serious problems with this paper. Another meta-analysis includes it, again, as a low risk of bias, rolls this rather terrible result into their aggregate of trying to measure the effect of ivermectin on COVID symptomology or mortality. And at this point in time, the preprint is withdrawn by the editors. I didn't even know editors could do that for a preprint. But the paper that cited this withdrawn preprint, I mean, they wrote a letter to the editor to say these people should be given time to respond. But 8 months after the publication of that paper, meta-analysis number 1, the meta-analysis is still there, without being corrected, without any editorial process, and without the ability for us to be able to engage with it on a topic that is very, 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 very important. Many tens of millions of doses of this drug, as far as we can tell, have been given to a whole variety of people in a whole variety of countries. And the best evidence that we have is that if it has an effect, it's a very weak effect. But the allegedly good information on it says that it's basically magic and that it works beautifully and it's going to save everyone's life. And we're only ignoring it because we're the sort of handmaidens of Big Pharma. Yeah, I think I could probably afford a nicer apartment if I was a handmaiden of Big Pharma, but we'll let that slide for now. So if I take this story and the other maybe 8 times that something like this has happened, and we put it all together, what do I think the problems are now? Well, firstly, everyone's in a rush, a noticeable decrease in accuracy. This is really hard to quantify. I'm speculating. You should be aware of that. A compression of publication times and an extension of how long post-publication peer review takes. So we're leaning even harder on the idea that if we can get it through peer review in 2 days, then it will be peer reviewed and we can rely on it forever. But if we have a problem with it, it could take months or a year or more to be able to expurgate all the bad things about the paper. Basically, we're rushing to give it the stamp, the irrevocable qualification, as soon as possible. Because basically, if we're scientists and we're trying to help, we're trying to science as hard as possible and as quickly as possible, as if it worked like that. I had to draw an analogy to this in a previous talk, and I said, if you were building a house and you run out of bricks, and it's like if someone said, oh, I see you've run out of bricks, and they went to the Lego store and they came back with one of those big bags of 1,000 and said, there you go. And I said, well, yes, these are bricks, but they're the wrong kind. I said, oh, but you don't understand, the store was closer. That's what we've done. That's what we've done with increasing the volume of this information as it is supposed to be made available. And it's been done through the mechanics, basically, of distorting the already poor peer review process to the point where now there's more of this than anyone can possibly handle. And believe me, your patience will run out completely if you find something that's been poorly peer reviewed and published and you try to deal with it. Your patience will run out long before the patience of everyone else you're dealing with will. Attention is a hell of a drug. So all of this being considered, here's the part where I don't like having to say the words. Let's say we're going to do something about this, and I think this probably fits more broadly into the thesis of what you've been talking about in Open Science Winter School. What do we change? What do we double down on? But also, what's not too radical? I promise you, I love radical ideas. I love having them. People start businesses around them. They ask me to consult for them. I'm always happy to talk to them. I'm also not going to propose ideas like they have. Other people's reforms are way cooler than my reforms.
James, can I just quickly jump in? Can you please solve all our problems in like 5 minutes? So
yes.
We get time for questions.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I'm happy to solve. Well, this is, I have 5 things, so we'll do 1 minute per slide. I'm on the clock. Let's go. I like preprints. I like something else more called computational reproducibility. I'm sorry. Basically, if a paper exists and it comes from a series of pieces of data and some statistical mechanics, and then it eventually ends up giving us an outcome. Reproducing that is the single best indicator that so many of the baseline errors that we see can actually go away. And this has never been easier than right now. To define the publication and dissemination of something in terms of, is it computationally reproducible? This is usually where people start talking about things like Jupyter notebooks, various functions of R, etc. The whole idea that you can start with the data and you can execute something, and that's part of a paper. That would make an enormous difference to the basic quality of not just preprints, but also eventual papers themselves. I would love to be able to replace the preprint with basically turnkey analyses that are showing that what is in your eventual output is related by laws to your inputs. That would be really, really, really fun. Also completely doable. Second thing, journals honestly are missing a tremendous opportunity to just have their own preprints. They could do it. It's fine. They already have the entire back end and mechanics for being able to support articles. So anyone who sends one to you, treat it as a preprint server, let it in. Don't review it. Review it when it becomes necessary, either because it's cited or because it has an outsized amount of views or because it has requests from readers or for some other reason. So this prevents a lot of things. It stops journal hopping dead. Like if I send something to the British Medical Journal preprints and it's preprinted and it stays there, it should not be going elsewhere. It should be allowed to just stay there in its entirety. You might be able to publish it elsewhere, but I mean, you would have to cite it. So we can call this like tiered or metric triggered peer review. Because look, the time and resources to be able to do this are limited. Do we want to review everything badly? Or do we want to review things that immediately prove to be more important really well? It also doesn't have to be completely synchronous with the appearance of the publication in the first place. I think it's fine to wait 3 to 6 months with a preprint that's in a journal group and then review it after that. I'm also going to draw a big distinction, this is me showing my hand here, between audit and review. Something that if you have a really strong public need, say for instance, a plague, or a viral level of publicity or serious issues that are being flagged somewhere else, there needs to be basically a second tier of review where we call in the statisticians and the people who will hit you with a chair leg if something's wrong. A lot of the time in biology and medicine, and sometimes a little bit of social science, statistical review is already paid. We already accept the fact that an expert tier of making sure something is computationally sound already exists. And I guarantee you that if you do what we do, we're not perfect, but we're a hell of a lot better than missing 95% of the errors, I promise you. Fourth thing, I'm trying, Jürgen. Data policies are ridiculous. Individual patient data is probably necessary to computationally reproduce. a lot of work in order to establish its trust. And a lot of fancy work groups have really, really bad data handling and management policies. If what happens in major papers that everyone is impressed with, if that happened with my 23-year-old intern, I would put him on notice. The internal mechanics of like data engineering and data management behind papers are really dreadful. And people love to hide behind privacy as an excuse. Now, I'm a big believer in the right to privacy, but at the same time, if you never ask people, are you okay with your completely de-identified data being released publicly, and they never answer the question, and then you say, well, that means no one can ever see my data ever again, you're continually painting yourself into a corner because journals just have to say yes. Make it a condition of publication, get a non-disclosure agreement, figure out a way where the journal can see the data, even if you can't give it away more publicly. There has to be a way where data can be interrogated on a paper-to-paper level if necessary. I can think of another 3 or 4 that we won't get into because I made a promise. Last thing, professional reviewers. A lot of peer review is not, no one is trained to do it. No one is given a formal process to follow. And we're continually replacing the people who have to do the vast majority of the work, which is PhD students and postdocs who do more than half of the reviewing, taking into account things like ghost reviews. This is hard. People who are continually learning to do science are also continually learning to review science. There's a lot of times there's no repository of knowledge. The weird thing is that super reviewers, if you look at the Publons figures, people who do a disproportionately high amount of review already exist. It's just that we don't really value or pay them. And we probably should, because they perform such an incredibly valuable function. Not only are they very good at what they do, but they're also very contemporary because they're reviewing literally everything else at the same time. And you know, you won't have to pay me $450 a review because, like, annualized out, that's way more than the salary of someone like this would ever have to be. It's much cheaper than paying reviewers on a piecemeal basis, is getting someone to continually do the reviews themselves. Okay, that's about as close to 5 minutes as I can get. If it all sounds like hard work and it will reduce productivity, good. The productivity is fake anyway. There should be less stuff that is better. Everyone has been saying this for the last 50 years, from chaos in the brickyard all the way forwards. I'm fine with that. Thank you for pointing it out. And what it really amounts to at the end of the day is put quality on a pedestal. I'm not interested in anything else as much as the pursuit of quality within scientific documents, especially when everyone gets the plague and dies, which, as everyone here is well informed, is really bad for you. I think I did it, Jürgen.
Thank you very much.